Let's do it. So thanks everybody for joining us in today's session. We're so happy to have you here with us. Before we begin with the introduction, I would like to start with thanking our hosts and sponsors. We've got the University of Washington Smart Center, Kaiser Permanente, and OSPI. And so my name is Tanya May. I'm the OSPI Director of Special Education, and I'm super excited to be the host this afternoon for our session with Sarah Arden. As I said a little bit ago, please share questions that you have and comments in the Q&A box, and we'll be monitoring that and trying to answer as many questions as we can throughout today's session. So it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Sarah Arden today to Virtual MTSS Fest. Sarah is a senior researcher at the American Institute for Research in the area of special education. And in this role, Dr. Arden acts as a service area coordinator and leads intensive technical assistance efforts of the Office of Special Education funded National Center on Intensive Intervention, or NCII. She also serves as an acting project director and implementation coordinator for a U.S. Department of Education funded Investing in Innovation and Improvement Development Research Grant, investigating district-wide implementation of tiered systems in mathematics with a focus on intensive interventions for students with disabilities and other at-risk learners, and also as a senior recruiter on Institutes of Education Science funded evaluation study of MTSS for reading in early grades. Sarah has also worked as a project director on multiple projects supporting schools and district implementation of response to intervention and multi-tier system of supports, as a cross-state learning collaborative lead for an OSEP-funded National Center on Systemic Improvement. She's also been an OSEP Fellowship Scholar at the University of Texas at Austin, and previously worked at the California Department of Education, the Clovis Unified School District, and as an adjunct professor in special education at California State University, Fresno. So excited, Sarah, to get to work with you and to get to be on this session with you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now. At the end of our session today, I'll pop back on with a few little housekeeping items before we close the session. So thanks, Sarah. Welcome.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks, Tanya. Thanks for the lovely introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm going to start the sharing of my screen now, and I think we should be good to go. Wow, I appreciate you all being here today on this rainy, cozy day. Hopefully we'll get some of that lovely sunshine back. And so I'm here today really to talk to you about the taxonomy of intervention intensity. Given the time parameters that we have today in our virtual setting, I'm going to spend most of our time today really introducing the taxonomy of intervention intensity and talking really about using it to select and design intervention. I'm going to talk about it a little bit for intensification and individualization, but there are, if you happen to see the slides that I posted, and if you haven't, they're available to you, you'll probably notice that there's a lot more slides than one can reasonably get through in an hour. I am from California. I do speak quite quickly, but I do not anticipate getting through 90-some slides in an hour. I'm not going to torture folks to do that. So what I plan to do ideally is to get through probably the first 40-ish or so slides, depending on the question and answer and how this goes in this hour, which will really sort of introduce the taxonomy, place it within the context of DI, which is data-based individualization, and that within the context of MTSS, and how you use that to really, the first two things, select and design interventions, and then leave it sort of up to you to do some reading on your own about intensification and individualization. We're going to talk about this a little tiny bit. And then there's a case study in these slides that you can look at on your own. I also will point you to the website for the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which is intensiveintervention.org. There are a multitude of resources on the taxonomy, both webinars, self-paced modules, and these slides. Really, there's a version of these slides that are about triple the length that you're seeing here if you want to go through those sort of in much more in depth. So just for the purposes today and for going sort of a little bit deeper rather than sort of a shallow, very quick overview, that's kind of what we're going to do today. So here's what we're going to talk through, and I sort of already said this. We're going to really sort of define the dimensions of the taxonomy, which I think is going to help you kind of think through the shaping of interventions, how we select them, both at Tier 2 and at Tier 3, special education even, and how that will help you kind of think through selecting and designing interventions, and then how we apply those interventions, or those dimensions, I'm sorry, of the taxonomy to evaluate interventions, to select them, or even how do we apply them if you're not picking interventions. I know many of you probably work in districts where you sort of have the interventions that you have, right? You're not sort of going in and buying or selecting all new ones, but how do you maybe select or choose out of the interventions that you do have? We'll talk a little bit about intensifying interventions, and then I'll show you some existing resources that are out there if you want to learn a little bit more. So there's a PDF of this form, which is the Taxonomy of Intervention Intensity really applied to academics, that I uploaded that you should have access to. It's bigger and it's prettier, just so you can see what it is. If you're also interested in learning about the Taxonomy of Intervention applied to behavior, this form is on the NCII website. The dimensions are a little bit different and some of the descriptions are tweaked, so we have that as well. For today, we're really going to talk about academics. We could spend a whole day together kind of talking about this, but I'm going to speak to this form quite a bit today. So if you want to look at it or open it up, you can if you've got two screens. If you're sort of working at home from a makeshift workspace like many of us are right now, although Tanya's working from the mountains, so that looks beautiful. Maybe she's got multiple screens up there, who knows. So this is the taxonomy of intervention that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to really speak to today these dimensions. So in this column, you'll see under dimensions, what we're going to talk about today is evaluating and identifying how can we play with, manipulate, adapt this dimension. So strength, dosage, alignment, attention to transfer, comprehensiveness, behavioral support, and individualization. How can we use those to help us select interventions? How can we use those to help us intensify interventions? How can we use those dimensions to help us sort out responsiveness to intervention? Did my student's intervention work, and how do I know? That's what we're gonna really talk about today. I'm going to talk about that within a frame of something that I call DBI, and not just me, but I said I because I'm the one talking today. The National Center on Intensive Intervention uses this frame of data-based individualization to really talk about what we mean as the most intensive levels of intervention or support for your kids with severe and persistent learning and behavioral needs. What we talk about is a systematic method for using data to determine when and how to provide more intensive intervention. So this is the kind of intervention that you're delivering for your students with the most intensive needs. Likely your students that are receiving Tier 3, probably your students that are receiving special education support, and kind of that sort of process. I'm not going to talk in depth about the process of DBI beyond that it is sort of an ongoing iterative process made up of multiple steps that have to do with intervention delivery, and I'm pointing here like you can see me, but you cannot, that begin with sort of delivery of a validated intervention program, likely what a lot of folks call Tier 2, some people call standardized protocol, I will use that word a bit later, or secondary intervention, followed by sort of this iterative process of progress monitoring, diagnostic data collection, intervention adaptation, and then progress monitoring, all sort of with a process of sort of iterative checks for responsiveness or access to see is the student accessing this instruction? If so, do we continue? If not, what do we adapt? What do we tweak? What do we manipulate so we can continue to make sure that students accessing the instruction? So we're going to talk about the taxonomy and where does it fit within DBI, and how can we sort of lay over the taxonomy into the process of DBI to make sure that we are selecting, designing, and intensifying interventions so that we can increase access. So far, so good. Hard when I can't see. all 300 and, oh my goodness, 307 of you. So I'm hoping that there's a thumbs up or two. But let me know, Tanya, if there's questions or things I need to address as I go. So like I said, really briefly, we're going to connect all of this. We've got kind of multiple frameworks fitting into each other here. So kind of think of those Russian doll approaches as they fit into each other here. We're thinking of all of these approaches within a multi-tiered system of support. So DBI fitting into a tiered system of support being sort of the most intensive level of intervention, but understanding that it doesn't exist within a vacuum, right? So that our most intensive level of intervention happens after we have delivered, or hopefully, some sort of less intensive level of intervention or standard protocol intensive level of intervention. And that likely happens in some sort of tier 2. And what the taxonomy of intervention hopefully helps us to do is have some sort of level of confidence that in our tier 2, we have selected and delivered an intervention that is maybe the right intervention, right? It is an intervention that matches our students' needs, or the students who haven't responded for a reason that isn't because we didn't give an intervention that wasn't a match for their needs, or we didn't give them enough intervention, or we didn't do some sort of other thing that we needed to do, right? So all of these things kind of fit together in a way that's really a true puzzle. So we're going to talk about how they all connect and how we can sort of manipulate each component or each dimension to try to figure out where we turn the dial up and when, hopefully to create sort of pieces of the puzzle where students can access intervention. So like I said before, we're going to use the taxonomy to sort of measure places where we can increase intervention intensity, select and design intervention intensity within the DBI process. And so there's these three sort of components here. We can look at it to help maybe evaluate our current interventions. Those can be interventions we're delivering at the tier 2 level, so the sort of top rectangle here, or interventions that we're delivering within tier 3, interventions we're delivering within special ed. We can use the taxonomy to help us select a new intervention. So maybe we've said, gosh, what we're doing just isn't working and we need to select something new. Now, I want to sort of caution here, a little asterisk or caveat. We don't mean this to say, we did this one time, a student didn't respond, we're going to use the taxonomy to help us pick a new intervention. So I want to caution, like, this doesn't mean you need to select a new intervention every time, but sometimes you really do need to choose a new intervention, and the taxonomy can help you in doing that, or help you as a district if you're selecting new interventions and you want to make sure you're picking the right one, you're being a conscious consumer, you're spending your money in the right places. It can also help in intensifying the interventions you do have in place. So just a couple of components first. We get questions about this a lot. Why do we need to start this process with a standardized evidence-based protocol? And what do I do if I don't have one of those in place? So I'm hoping we have maybe some middle school math teachers on here who are saying, what do I do if I don't have an evidence-based tier 2 math intervention? Or what do I do here? And what do I do? How do I start this process? Like, what tier 2 program are you going to give me? And so I want to just give a caveat here of why we say, and not just we, but why the evidence says that you need to start with this. And so really sort of the science behind this says when properly aligned to a student's needs, and alignment here, attention to transfer and alignment, is an element of the dimension of the taxonomy, which we're going to talk about in a minute. It says that those interventions really tend to work, and it creates less sort of teacher need to reinvent the wheel. That tier 2 interventions are efficient when selected correctly, and teachers can plan instructions for groups rather than individual students. And really many require only a modest amount of training, or paras can help, and they're often inexpensive, though the cost may vary. And so that's just sort of a side note. I just wanted to put that as an aside before we really talk about selecting and intensifying. And then for those of you that are on that are saying, well, can I still implement this, or can I still go through the taxonomy? Can I still intensify or select interventions or do this tier 3 intensive intervention piece if I don't have one of these tier 2 or standard protocol programs? And the answer would be yes. And so we always have this guy, I don't know why we called him Tony, but we know your students are struggling with fractions, but there aren't any EBPs for that. Can you just check back in a couple of years? And so these two slides are just sort of an aside to say, we understand that there are places where you're not necessarily selecting out of a series of boxed programs or standard protocol programs for tier 2. And so some of these elements of the taxonomy might not apply to you as well as we would hope they would, but we would hope that you would sort of continue forth with the best information that you have, given sort of what's out there, and move forward. Excuse me, Tanya gave me her allergies. And move forward with what you can. You can certainly still implement intensified interventions given the taxonomy, even if there's not a standard evidence-based program in place. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I don't want to spend too much time on that before we start going through the intervention, the taxonomy piece. So let's talk about now elements of validated intervention programs. So there's two different elements that we need to think about. First, how are they designed? So we're going to talk about those dimensions of the taxonomy of intervention intensity, and that really teaches us sort of the what of the intervention, and then we're going to talk about how they're implemented, and that teaches us the how. These are two different components of intervention delivery, both of design and delivery, that we can manipulate or play with. And like I talked about earlier, they're sort of pieces of these dials that we can think about sort of toying with or playing with as we talk about intervention delivery and intensification and selection of and design of, that we can sort of adapt or adjust, if you will, as we think about intervention delivery. So both the design and the fidelity. So there's all these different components, and I'm going to click until I don't remember how many animations are on here. So we're going to, oops, there we go. There's that many, okay? So there's all these different components of validated intervention that we need to consider, right? There are things like connection to Tier 1 instruction, alignment with grade level standards, evidence-based programs, effect sizes, group sizes, excuse me, accidentally clicked us forward, concrete learning opportunities, connection to Tier 1, breaking tasks, all of these sort of components. And it would be really helpful to think if there's a framework to guide our thinking as we're deciding what interventions to use and how to adapt them. I'm curious, and I can't see you raise your hands, but I'm wondering if any of you have ever thought, what do I change first? If I'm going to adapt an intervention or my student just isn't responding, I've delivered this Tier 2 intervention or this Tier 3 intervention or this intervention for my student with a disability or even my student with a disability is in Tier 2 or whatever, and they're not responding. What do I do first? How do I know what to change first? Now, the taxonomy isn't necessarily going to tell you what to change first, which is kind of tricky because it's sort of implied in the word taxonomy that it's going to tell you 1, 2, 3. But I'm curious, and I bet many of you have said, gosh, if I just knew what to change first, or if I just knew which components to change, that would be really helpful. And it's that thinking, it's those questions that led to the development of the taxonomy, or this framework to guide how the taxonomy was developed, because folks were doing things like changing the group size and breaking things into smaller tasks and the alignment and the opportunities to respond all at one time, and then we didn't know sort of what was having an impact. So that's sort of how the taxonomy came to be. So because of that thinking, what was developed by Doug and Lynn Fuchs and their colleagues Amelia Malone and a number of other folks was this notion of the taxonomy of intervention intensity, and that there are these dimensions, which is in this column on the left-hand side if you're facing the taxonomy handout, that there's these dimensions that we're able to manipulate that will impact the intervention intensity, both like I talked about, the what and the how, right? And these are the descriptions on the right here of what these pieces mean. And I'm going to go through these one at a time and talk about the descriptions and talk about if they're able to be manipulated or not, and talk about how you can think of them both in your selection of interventions. So maybe you're selecting a new intervention at Tier 2, at Tier 3 for your students with disabilities, or somewhere throughout your sort of continuum of interventions, in your design of interventions, or maybe in the way that you intensify interventions, right? So some of these, as you probably are already hypothesizing, are able to be manipulated more than others. And some of them will help you sort of think about intensification. And some of them are really able to be used more in the select and design component of intensification or of intervention selection, right? So that's sort of how we got to the taxonomy, how it came to be, and how it's used. So far, so good. Tanya, anything I need to address? Good. Thumbs up. Great. So this slide has a lot of questions on it, and I understand that it has a lot of text, but I like them all on one page, so I left them there. This component, this handout on the bottom, really just is going, piece here refers you back to this slide. So what I like to do is say these questions each refer to one of the dimensions, and I think they're good questions to know about to help you consider asking sort of each question for the dimensions. So a good question to ask when you're thinking about strength as a dimension of the taxonomy is there evidence to suggest that the intervention is expected to lead to improved outcomes? I think we always assume that any intervention we pick up would be expected to lead to improved outcomes, but that's not necessarily the case. And it's not necessarily the case for all kids. And so it's important as we become conscious consumers of both the interventions that we purchase and the interventions that we use, that they're not all researched for all kids in all situations. They're not all designed for all kids in all situations. And there isn't always evidence to suggest that that intervention is expected to lead to improved outcomes in that situation. And so this question is a good one for us to ask, especially for those of you in the case where you are selecting, where you are in a position where you are selecting an intervention. And I'm going to talk to you about how you can find that out. Another question along the next dimension is around dosage. Dosage, the good questions for us to ask is, will the group size, will the duration, will the frequency provide sufficient opportunities to respond? We're going to spend a lot of time talking about dosage. That's a really good one that we can manipulate. And we often sort of underutilize dosage. We think about it as more or less. We don't think about it as able to be manipulated in the ways that it can be. The alignment piece, a good way to think about that is, does intervention match the student's identified needs? This is another case where we really sometimes do a poor job. Sometimes it comes because we only have one intervention to deliver, so we just deliver the intervention that we have. We see that happen in many schools, but it's a really good thing for us to think about. Attention to transfer, that dimension refers to, does this intervention assist the student in generalizing the learned skills to generalization or to other tasks? This comprehensiveness one, sorry, I'm moving our photos because we're covering up my words. Does the intervention include elements of explicit instruction? And then this one down here, this next piece, does the student have opportunities to develop the behavior skills needed to be successful? And can the intervention be easily integrated into academic instruction? I'm not sure who all we have on the call here, but I'm guessing that many of you work with kids with academic and behavior needs, and most of those kids who have academic needs typically have behavior needs, and most of your kids that have needs and behavior also have academic needs, and they don't typically leave one at the door and just bring the other in. So we need to think about how our interventions are sort of mutually supporting both academic and behavior needs of our kids. And then the last one, can the intervention be individualized with database processes? Does it allow us to do that? Or is it designed to be used for a group and it cannot do that? These are really good questions for us to ask as we start to manipulate the intervention. So moving forward, strength. The dimension of strength can be sort of boiled down into a couple of things. How well does the intervention work for students with intensive intervention needs? And the taxonomy really asks that for students below the 20th percentile. So the designers of the taxonomy, that's how they defined it. They wanted to know, has this intervention been evaluated empirically using scientifically sound, rigorous methodology? Were there effects for the studies? So they looked, and they encouraged you to look at effect sizes for the studies, for group designs, for single case designs. Were there effect sizes? I'm just going to come out and tell you, strength is one of the components of the taxonomy that you're not going to really be able to manipulate at all, right? You're not going to be able to take a study and make it stronger or less strong, but it is important that you know if an intervention that you've chosen is reputable, can it be trusted? Was it designed for students that are like your students? If you are working with populations of students that are language learners, that are diverse, that come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, that are students of color, and you are working on an intervention that was designed on middle-class white students from a non-diverse background, I would encourage you to find that out, because that intervention may not work with your students, right? Were the outcomes of interest relevant to your students? If you are going to work one-on-one in students with a group of students for your intervention, and this intervention that you're working with only tested on large groups of students, it's worth finding that out, okay? So strength is not necessarily something you can manipulate, right? But it is something worth finding out. Luckily, you do not have to do this work on your own. There are lots of researchers and methodologists and psychometricians who love to do this work for you. And so there are lots of places out there where you can find things like statistical significance and effect sizes. And I'm not going to go that far into it, but there are places you can find this out. You can find the effect size of a study. And this is a very broad generalization here. But generally speaking, this table shows you a way to find the strength of an intervention would be to look at an effect size. The stronger the effect size, the stronger the intervention, okay? So an effect size of a 0.2 or higher, 0.2 to 0.3 would be small, 0.3 to 0.4 would be moderate, 0.5 would be large, would be considered a strong effect size. Some caveats here about effect sizes is that they're not always available, and they can really be impacted by study conditions and content. So, for example, effect sizes on studies on interventions of reading comprehension are always going to be smaller than effect sizes on interventions of vocabulary or decoding. Effect sizes for interventions with older students are always or typically lower than effect sizes for interventions meant for younger students. So there's things to know here, and they must be interpreted with caution. But it's just good to know that if you are selecting a new intervention, you should find out, is there evidence to show that somebody did some research on this and it had an effect size, and that the people that did the research on it are not just the designers of the intervention. You want independent researchers outside of the publishers of the intervention that did some research and that there's an effect size. It's a starting point for consideration. Okay, and there's a lot of places that can give you this information. Here's 3 good ones. Okay? And that's really all we're going to talk about with strength, because the other ones are the ones you can really, really manipulate. Okay, these are 3 good places to start though. What Works Clearinghouse has done this work for you, Best Evidence Encyclopedia, and NCI Tools Charts. You can look up the interventions you're using, and you should be able to find across these places at least some evidence of the interventions you're looking for. Now, dosage is one of the most interesting elements of the taxonomy, I believe, and the one that I think we sort of give the least amount of attention to. So oftentimes when we ask people, what they want, what would you like when you're delivering intervention? What would be helpful to you? They say, oh gosh, if we just had more time, I would love it. My students would respond to intervention if we just had more time. But what they forget, and what we sort of is lost in that part of the conversation, is that sometimes it's not just more time that's important, but it's more time, more valuable time. So what we mean by dosage here is not just more time, but the number of opportunities that a student must respond and receive corrective feedback. Or for behavior, the number of opportunities a student can respond, receive positive feedback, exchange for backup reinforcers, and receive corrective feedback. So it's not just more time, it's more valuable time, or potentially less invaluable time. So dosage is one of the components of the taxonomy that can really be manipulated in order for, excuse me, in order for us to really manipulate intervention intensity. This can be the number of sessions, so the frequency of sessions, the duration of intervention sessions, the student-to-teacher ratio, the number of practice problems provided, okay? So we also need to think about when we're manipulating dosage. This can be both in Tier 2 and Tier 3 for special education. We need to think about a student's history. How much time have they had an intervention leading up to this point? What is their history of sort of struggles in academics? Are we giving them just louder and slower instruction by adding time? Are we asking them to do more of what they hate and are bad at, right? Are we giving them more time at the end of a day, which is harder for them, and so we're actually just adding failure, correct? And so dosage is a thing that we sort of fail to manipulate in a way that can be very powerful for intensifying, selecting, and designing intervention. If we can find ways to schedule and add in maybe more shorter sessions, or more sessions with a lower student-to-teacher ratio, or maybe less sessions with a higher student-to-teacher ratio, because some students can actually respond more there, it can really impact dosage and allow us to manipulate the intensity of intervention in ways that we haven't necessarily done before. On the NCII website, and I think it's linked at the very end of this presentation, there is a lengthy document that talks about creative ways to schedule intensive intervention. And I know as I talk about dosage, people always say, but where is the time to do this? And we go through multiple ways that you can think through this. But dosage is a way that I really encourage you to think about getting in the required amount of time that an intervention asks for in a way that sort of can meet these needs, but you can also sort of manipulate, like I'm talking about, across the continuum of needs and sort of play with dosage. It's not just more time, but it's how it's used. Alignment is the next sort of component of the taxonomy that I think is worth talking about. This is sort of an age-old sort of trite analogy here, but a hammer is an effective tool, but not with a screw. Alignment has to do with does the intervention match a student's needs? And so often what we'll see is a school or a building or a teacher saying, I've been delivering with this intervention with fidelity, I've given it for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and I'm tracking data, and I'm going here, and I'm doing all this, and the student just isn't responding. And sometimes what we see is that either the intervention is well beyond the student's capacity, so they're way outside this, they have sort of assumed a level of mastery that the student hasn't mastered yet, or it's not aligned to the student's needs. So this would be, you know, the student has a decoding issue and they're providing a reading comprehension intervention or something like that, in that, you know, a similar analogy for mathematics. So alignment has to do with, we think we have an understanding of the student's needs, but we have provided an intervention that is not aligned to their needs. So I encourage you, as you start to think about intervention, really to sort of dig deep and to assess the full set of a specific student's academic deficits. Make sure we're addressing the skills the student has not, the student's already mastered, and incorporating a focus on grade level standards. So sometimes we see cases where we are assuming that a student has mastered a skill and we move forward and we build upon that skill, but we never go back and check, have they mastered it and continue to master it? So we build upon that mastery, and we assume that a student, especially our students with intensive needs, once they've mastered a skill, they continue to master a skill. And that's not always the case. And so we'll move forward with that, and then we're building upon, like I mentioned earlier, what I call the level of assumed mastery. And our students often just don't master things and keep them mastered. You see this a lot in mathematics, where we end up with these weird sort of patchy holes in math skills, where at one point a student could divide, but then a few weeks later they can't divide anymore, but now you sort of built upon skills that maybe require that. And so you find students have these very strange gaps or holes because you assumed they mastered a skill that they have now sort of forgotten. So alignment, the taxonomy asks you to really look at alignment with these and to make sure that we are addressing the full set of a student's academic deficits. It also asks us to look at behavioral alignment. So if we're looking at an intervention that addresses behavior, looking at how to address school-wide expectations, how to address classroom and teacher expectations. And here on the second bullet, I also encourage folks to look at specific teacher expectations. You know, some teachers have higher or lower tolerance for certain behaviors. And so sometimes we sort of forget about those things when we're looking at individual student and teacher match. We want to look at how interventions address student skill deficits, how they match rewards and student preferences and functions of problems. We often don't look at what is rewarding or punishing to individual students. We do a really nice job of coming up with what is rewarding or punishing to adults and overlaying that onto a behavioral intervention for a student, because that is rewarding or punishing to a student, and we assume that, but we don't do that very well for students. And then we also want to make sure that we're not addressing extraneous skills. So just important things as we're thinking about selecting and intensifying behavioral interventions. And I know I'm moving kind of quick here, but I want to make sure I get us to the point where we can ask a couple of questions as needed. Are we okay so far, Tanya? Good?
We have one. I've been trying to answer some of them as we go, sharing links,
Okay.
so that's been going fine. One of them I wasn't exactly sure how to answer. It was on some of your slides toward the bottom, there's a little icon that says handout.
Mm-hmm.
And so people were just wondering, are those themselves links, and how can they find those?
They should be just referring to the PDFs that were attached, the 3 PDFs that were given, the ones that like how and when to use the taxonomy and the definition of the taxonomy. I don't think there were any other handouts that were provided, unless I forgot to attach a handout, but I don't think that there were any.
Okay, sounds great. We'll share that general link then. Thank you.
Okay, yep, for sure. A couple more sort of elements of the taxonomy to think of is this attention to transfer. So this is a really tricky one, and one that's a little harder for us to manipulate, but important to consider is to what extent is the intervention systematically designed to help students transfer skills they learn to other formats or contexts. So to help students realize the connection between mastered and related skills, and to demonstrate efficacy on standardized measures or measures of generalization. Now, where people get stuck here is they think this means the best way to address this is to just use the materials that come with the core curriculum that say intervention on the box, right? Because that means that they will automatically transfer the skills that they learn in those intervention materials right on back to the core curriculum, and we'll move along our way. And so what I would encourage you to think about, if that's where your mind went immediately, which I understand why it would go there, is to go back and think about the strength dimension. And I want you to think about that dimension if you're using those materials that came with your core curriculum that say Tier 2 or intervention. I want you to think about strength. And if you're using those for intervention, I will encourage you to go back to your classrooms, or, well, you're not going back to your classrooms. Don't go back to your classrooms right now. Go back to your houses, your living rooms, or wherever you are, and look, if you can, as to how those intervention materials actually were researched and studied, and were they actually, is there actually any evidence that they were designed for intervention? Those sort of core curriculum materials that say intervention, is there any research? Were they used as intervention materials? How is it that they were sort of designed for intervention? So that's sort of a homework task if you've got some time to do some homework over the next couple of months to think about. What this actually means with attention to transfer in academics is, are there ways that we can think about bridging the gap in an intervention to sort of systematically start to design generalization back in? So things like vocabulary skills. Are we using similar vocabulary to start to generalize? So for the project, in my introduction, Tanya mentioned that I was working on an intervention, implementation of intervention project. That was actually happening in a Washington district, at implementation of intensive intervention in mathematics. One of the things that we did to address attention to transfer in that project is we mapped the core curriculum in mathematics in that district, K-5, to the intervention materials that were being used in mathematics in that district. And we looked at all of the lessons in core and all of the intervention materials that they were using. And we noticed that less than 30% of the vocabulary in mathematics, there was less than 30% of overlap in the vocabulary that was used in core curriculum and mathematics. And that had come up over and over again in the district, was that students just didn't understand that in core, when they were saying numerator and denominator, and in intervention, they were saying top number, bottom number, that meant the same thing. That our students, these students that were getting intervention, couldn't go from one classroom to the other classroom and start to generalize. So this attention to transfer piece really asks educators to start to think about building in ways that students can realize this connection. Some programs are better at this than others. Some programs play with core materials better than others, and some don't. This requires you to do a little building, a little bit of digging on your own, and starts to build in and asks you to start to build in ways that you can make those connections if it doesn't offer that. So in this particular district where we were working, just learning that less than 30% of the vocabulary was similar was enough for us to start to say, okay, intervention staff, you have to work with the general education staff to sort out what vocabulary are we going to use to start to generalize. That was a way that we both intensified core and intervention at the same time, because it allowed us to build this bridge to generalize. And it's hard for me to sort of talk about this without seeing people face to face, but I hope that that makes sense. Also, there's ways to do this attention to transfer and behavior. So we want to make sure that our interventions allow us to think about how and when a student uses a skill across contexts and situations. I was a special ed teacher for about 8 years, and I can't tell you how many times I had a student perform a skill or act a certain way in my classroom, and then they could get to their general education classroom or music or specials or PE or somewhere, and they just wouldn't do it, or they couldn't do it. They didn't recognize that that same skill needed to be used in a different context or a different place. So as we build in or design or select an intervention, especially in behavior, we want to make sure that the program reinforces the use of those skills across contexts and situations. We often just assume that that can happen, and we don't think about that the students that we're designing these interventions for, they don't automatically do that. They need support for doing those things. So that's something to consider as we design those. We also need to think about comprehensiveness. So reflecting the number of explicit instruction principles that the intervention incorporates. These are all elements of explicit instruction, providing explanations in simple, direct language, modeling efficient strategies. I'm not going to read them all to you, but gradually fading support, incorporating systematic cumulative review. On the intensive intervention website, there is a self-paced module and a course on explicit instruction. Especially for special educators, not just special educators, but a lot of special educators don't get coursework on explicit instruction when they're getting credentialed. So we actually find a lot of them coming to this module to learn about explicit instruction. So I encourage you to go there and think about that as you're evaluating your interventions and thinking about which pieces of this intervention can I intensify, or are there pieces of this that we like or don't like. I encourage you to think through, is this comprehensive? Does this intervention allow us to think about these components of explicit instruction? And I'm going to move forward with that. Also in behavior, does it allow us to explicitly address behavior? And there are some pieces of behavior that we really want to think about. Excuse me, behavioral support in academics, really being self-regulation and executive functioning, and minimizing non-productive behavior in our in the taxonomy of intervention, especially the behavioral support within academic interventions. This is often a really sort of forgotten about component as we intensify our academic interventions. And a lot of times we see people miss this. When we ask, does the student engage in behavioral or have behavioral needs if they're not responding to academic interventions? We'll hear educators say, no, they don't have any behavioral needs. And what they mean is they say they're not engaging in these sort of hugely off-task behaviors that cause sort of room clears or really sort of aggressive behaviors. But what they miss is the students that need sort of self-regulation supports, or students that need executive function supports, or students that are engaged in non-productive behavior. So we encourage you to think about students that need these and to build them in as a way to intensify behavior, because these are often things that block students from accessing academic interventions, and really are the things that are sort of causing students to not access or not respond to intervention. And there's a couple of examples here of ways that we can promote both executive function and really sort of address minimizing non-productive behavior. A couple of good questions sort of to support behavioral intervention. Are behavioral interventions easily integrated within the context of academic instruction? So sometimes what we'll see as folks are thinking about this dimension of academic support for behavioral intervention is we'll find a really nicely designed academic intervention, and then we see a totally separated, siloed behavioral intervention, something that one teacher could not possibly do together. So we really encourage folks to think about easily integrating these things if possible. Do they complement rather than supplant the academic focus? Not to say that one is more important than the other, but we do want to see them integrated if possible. This is a really simple slide to describe something that is extremely complex and very challenging and very hard to do. So I don't want you to think as I'm describing this that I mean easily integrating behavioral and academic interventions together in a complementary way that includes procedures for reinforcement is easy. This probably is one of the most complex things that I have described today, but it's good questions to ask as you're saying, gosh, I've delivered this intervention and I've done it with fidelity and I've done these pieces and my student still isn't responding. We would encourage you to ask these questions because often we haven't thought about academic support and behavioral interventions as going hand in hand. And so I'm coming close. I've got about 15 minutes left here. So there's a couple of things you can do with the taxonomy. You can use it to find the best intervention, like I talked about. So knowing that there's no perfect intervention, but the taxonomy can help you understand both the strengths and weaknesses of your current intervention and support your selection of a new intervention, right? It can also help you evaluate your current intervention. So you could be, and this should be, there's a handout that you have that should sort of explain some of this in a little more detail. So if you're in a spot where you're saying, gosh, we need some additional interventions in our district and we don't know what we're going to do, you could use the taxonomy to help you sort of select them, start with strengths, go through sort of the dimensions and say, what are we going to do? You could be in the case where you're delivering intervention and you have students that aren't responding and you don't know what to change, or you don't know what to tweak, or you're not sure what to do. You could use the taxonomy to say, gosh, what do we change first? Have we manipulated all these components of dosage in the right way? Have we manipulated, have we really looked at alignment the right way? Have we really integrated behavioral components in the way that we thought we should? You can't, like I said, really manipulate strength, but what you could look at is say, is the intervention we've selected strong? Does it match the kind of students we're delivering it for? Is there evidence to show that this intervention works? Because maybe you've selected one that there isn't evidence for. That would probably be good to know. I would also encourage you, if you're using core curriculum, if you're using materials like that, to just seek that out and find that information out. Be sort of a conscious consumer of the materials that you have. These are really good things to do before you start to manipulate and sort of strengthen and change the interventions that you have. Okay, there are a lot of ways to do this. On the NCII website, there's a rubric that allows you to go through and sort of manipulate and rate each standard. I didn't provide you with that. It's very long. I'm sorry, it's not very long. It's just a very meaty sort of PDF. So I didn't give that, but it's easy to find if you go to the website and search taxonomy. It's also linked at the end of these slides. It can help you go through each dimension and rate your intervention. So if you'd like to do that, you can do that. And then, excuse me, if you want to go through, like I said, there's no hard and fast rules for the ratings. So the rubric actually gives you a little bit more detail. The questions that we get here about this rating, we often get educators asking us, did I rate my intervention correctly? They want to know for sure, like, should I give it a 2 or should I give it a 3? Should I give it a 1? Should I give it a 2? People really like rules. And so we've described the ratings, but it's sort of up to folks how to sort of rate what they have. But we can certainly walk people through these if they'd like, but there is sort of a rubric out there if you want to rate through these. The last dimension of the taxonomy that I'm going to talk through today is individualization. And we don't give a rating on the rubric for this because it's really sort of hard for us to know, allow you to sort of be able to tell if you could individualize an intervention. But individualization, like we said, is the last component. It allows you to be able to tell, is an intervention able to be individualized or tweaked in response to ongoing progress monitoring data based on a student's complex learning needs. So something that's really important here is to know, do you have ongoing progress monitoring data? That's really, really important here. So, excuse me. So if you don't have ongoing progress monitoring data, I would encourage you as part of the individualization component to make sure that that's happening as you start to rate interventions, and make sure that in order for you to be able to tell if students are responsive or not responsive, is that you're doing that based on ongoing progress monitoring data. The last sort of couple of slides here, and there's a few more, and I have a few more minutes here, are about implementation with fidelity. So we know, like I said, like I mentioned earlier, not only do we want to make sure we have the what, right, what we're implementing, but how we're implementing it is also important. So you can have the most perfectly designed intervention that fits all of these elements of the taxonomy as best we can, checks all of the boxes off, is strong, is aligned, can be individualized as needed, has a behavioral component integrated, is as good as it gets as far as those goes. But if we implement it poorly, it's not going to get us anywhere. So there's a couple of things that are important for you to understand about fidelity. Fidelity ensures that instruction's been implemented as intended. It allows us to link student outcomes to instruction, helps in the determination of if intervention's working, and it really helps us link positive outcomes to depend on a level of fidelity. Another component I talked about earlier, one thing that we see a lot is if a teacher comes to us and says, I've delivered this, I don't know what's happening, a student isn't responding. One thing we see a lot is that teachers have assumed a level of mastery that a student hasn't done. That's one of our most frequent things that we see if a student isn't responding. Another thing we see though, and it's almost more common, is an issue with fidelity. If a student isn't responding, one of our first things we ask is, was the student present for intervention? And almost very, very frequently, we will find out that a teacher has tracked data on the days the student was there, but often intervention is scheduled on days where a student wasn't there or didn't bring his glasses or was 20 minutes late, or that was the day we had a, God knows what, a rally, or a school got out early or didn't come, or all of these things that get, in the way. So fidelity is really important because we want to make sure that intervention is being delivered as intended and that it really allows us to link to student outcomes. There's a few elements of fidelity that are really important to think of. It's not just that we deliver as intended, but that the quality was good, that we did the program as intended. Adults love to skip pieces of programs that they hate. Boy, do we love to do that. We don't like pieces of it, so we just don't do those pieces. That's issues with fidelity. And that students are engaged, right? And that they're exposed to all of the components. So there's a lot of elements of fidelity that we need to consider, right? And there's all these pieces that we can talk through. And and that we monitor all of these pieces. So there's a lot of ways to monitor fidelity, and I'm going to end here in just a second, right? But it's important for us to think about intensification not just as the what we delivered, but as the how we delivered it, right? So did we adhere to the program? Was there enough exposure? Was the quality of the delivery right? Did we, were we engaged? Was the student engaged? Were we, did we do the intervention components the way we were supposed to? Did we adhere to the program? Okay. And then if we adapt an intervention based on a student need, what becomes our fidelity is a student data. So if we do actually stray away from exactly how an intervention was supposed to be developed, and we do that based on data, based on a student's response, what we need to do is document and adapt based on a student need. So given that, remember that valid interventions set the foundation for intensive intervention. They should be evidence-based, they should be implemented with fidelity, and they should allow for individualizations for students not responding. I think that is what I have. I know that was a lot in 55 minutes. What follows in these slides is a case study that talks you through a student, and I knew we wouldn't have time to get to it. This is exactly where I hoped we'd end up. There's a case study that talks you through applying the taxonomy. So I encourage you to look through that so you can see what it looks like. And then there are a number of resources at the very end, which I can sort of flip through really quick. I encourage you to go through the case study because it's going to take you through to every single dimension so you can see those. And then there are resources at the end. These are all of the components of the taxonomy that I was telling you about. There's the overview, there's examples in reading, mathematics, and behavior. There's the checklist, the other components that I was mentioning, and a number of other resources that I mentioned about the taxonomy on the website. They're all linked at the end of these slides should you want additional resources about what we talked through very quickly today.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah,
We've got, I just wanted to talk you through some of the questions. We tried to resolve what we could throughout, but just so that you know some of the questions that were asked. A couple times people were just trying to clarify how and where to get the handout, so we shared that in a couple different ways. If anyone, still needs that, we can put it up again. I also shared the intensive intervention website, so that's linked up on there. As I'm scrolling through some of the questions, right before your slide 20, where you share the different ways that people can look at effect sizes, someone had asked that, so I shared the links that you have on that slide. So those are in the chat as well, they're in the Q&A. And then one question toward the end was, where's the best place to find top-rated interventions for our grade level and subject? So what I shared so far was just the link that goes to the rubrics and the tools charts, but I wanted to give you a chance to speak to it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a slide in the middle of this that shows like the NCII website, the What Works Clearinghouse website, and the Best Evidence website. Now, I want to put a caveat there. NCII doesn't rate, we don't endorse interventions. What we do is review interventions that are sent to us, kind of the same as What Works Clearinghouse and Best Evidence. Because we're all government funded, it's not an endorsement of, it's a review of the evidence of. So you're going to see a lot of duplication on those websites. There will be some interventions that are on some websites that are not on the others. We only review the ones that are sent to us, but intervention developers like their materials to be reviewed and to be on websites, so they're going to be pretty comprehensive. So those three places are going to be pretty comprehensive. They are pretty user-friendly. I would say the What Works Clearinghouse sort of user guides are a really good place to start, but NCII's materials are also really good and really useful. So that would be the good place to go. The NCII tools charts, which are linked on that slide kind of in the middle here, and I can go back to it. You can filter by grade level and by content area. So you can look at it and say, I want third grade mathematics, or fractions or elementary reading, decoding, and it'll filter all the interventions based on that. They're all pretty filterable. So I would go back and I can scroll through, but you can also probably find it. It's this.
Yeah, I think it was slide 20. I think so.
Okay. Yeah. There's also, for whoever asked this slide, yeah, for whoever asked about effect sizes, if you're curious about effect sizes, there is an extensive amount of information on effect sizes on the NCII tool starts, if anybody wants to know more information about effect sizes.
Okay, so we've got some other questions that came in. We've got maybe just one more minute, so I'll ask one last one, Sarah. Where's the best place to find more information on how to effectively bridge the gap and support generalization for students multiple grade levels below their peers or their standards?
So I would actually look at, this was like the tiniest abridged information on the taxonomy. The information that's at the end of this, there are like multiple webinars about the taxonomy. Some of this information, probably some of these pieces, are going to go into the elements in much more, like here's case examples, in much more detail. There are going to be multiple slides on each dimension, and they're going to talk about students that are considerably below grade level. I would start there and then see if that answers your questions, because there's also case examples across content areas. I would start there and then see if you still have questions, because there's so much content here that should answer your question.
Okay, thanks. So, Sarah, are you okay if I share the closing slide here? As
yes,
I want to make sure that we just let people know. We know we haven't answered every question that people had. So we are going to look through the Q&A and see what questions didn't get connected or answered today, and then those will be available on the session or MTSS webpage. If you still have lingering questions, you also could submit them to cisl@k12.wa.us. A recording of today's session will be available by May 4th on the MTSS webpage, and it will include captioning. And then the final just reminder I wanted to share with everyone was to make sure that if you'd like to get clock hours, that you use the link that's on the MTSS webpage. I believe that has to get filled out today. So if you need any help, reach out to, again, CISL or any of us, and we can support with that. So I just wanted to say, Sarah, thank you again for today. This was really helpful and informative, and I know that we'll go through and make sure that we've addressed any lingering questions.
Absolutely. Thank you to all 300 of you for coming. I appreciate it.